The Battle of Slim Buttes was fought on September 9 and 10, 1876, in the Great Sioux Reservation in the Dakota Territory, between the United States Army and the Sioux. The Battle of Slim Buttes was the first U.S. Army victory of the Great Sioux War of 1876 after General George Custer's defeat of the Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25 and 26, 1876. Brigadier General George Crook, one of the U.S. Army's ablest Indian fighters, led the Horsemeat March, one of the most grueling military expeditions in American history, destroying Ogallala Chief American Horse's village at Slim Buttes and repelling a counter-attack by Crazy Horse. The American public was fixed on news of the defeat of Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and war correspondents with national newspapers fought alongside General Crook and reported the events. The Battle of Slim Buttes signaled a series of punitive blows that ultimately broke Sioux armed resistance to reservation captivity and forced their loss of the Black Hills, Pahasapa. Prelude to War. Black Hills Gold Rush in 1874. Lt. Col. George Armstrong Custer led a military expedition of 1,000 men from Fort Abraham Lincoln near Bismarck to investigate reports of gold and to determine a suitable location for a military fort in the Black Hills of the Great Sioux Reservation. Before Custer's column had returned to Fort Abraham Lincoln, news of the discovery of gold in the Black Hills was telegraphed as an international news event. War correspondent John A. Finnerty reported, "A wall of fire, not to mention a wall of Indians, could not stop the encroachment of that terrible white race before which all other races of white kind have gone down." At the news of gold, the grizzled 49ers shook the dust of California from their feet and started for the far distant hills. The Australian miner left his pack and started by saddle and ship for the same goal, the diamond hunter of the Cape, the veteran prospector of Colorado and Montana, the reduced gentleman of Europe, the worried and worn clerks of London, Liverpool, New York, or Chicago, the studdy Scotchman and the light-hearted Irishman, who drinks the spirit of adventure with his mother's milk. The miners of Wales and Cornwall and the gamblers of Monte Carlo came trooping in masses to the new El Dorado. Safety of the settlers. Custer's announcement of gold in the Black Hills triggered the Black Hills Gold Rush, with an influx of thousands of immigrants. Mining towns and settlements began to spring up throughout the Black Hills and tensions increased between the Sioux and whites. The U.S. government was alarmed at reports of frequent Sioux attacks against miners and settlers. In 1876, Custer City miners organized a 125-man militia known as the Black Hills Rangers to protect miners and settlements, and escort immigrants through dangerous canyons where angry Sioux often waited in ambush. Captain Jack Crawford was appointed as chief of scouts of a special unit of about 12 experienced fighting men to look for Indian signs. War correspondent Robert Strahorn reported the deteriorating situation between settlers and Indians. Not one of the thousands restless spirits who had gathered in the Black Hills but had tasted or severely felt the fiendish hand of the red man bound for revenge for the occupancy of their country. Not less than 400 whites had been murdered since the previous spring, and no man was safe in venturing beyond the confines of the towns, which had been kept in a state of terror for many months of fear of a wholesale descent of such a force of Indians as we had just defeated, which would wipe out every soul and every vestige of their handiwork. When, as rarely happened, an Indian was killed, the settlement went wild with delight, and his skull and scalp were paraded and sold to the highest bidder in the streets of Deadwood. Manifest Destiny. Initially, the U.S. Army made bona fide efforts to enforce the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868 and evicted encroaching miners. General Crook was using such of his forces as was possible to hold back the tide of gold-seekers persisting in invading the Black Hills and Bighorn regions from the south, while General Terry at Fort Lincoln near Bismarck was ineffectively endeavoring to restrain a light lawless flood from that direction. But after the discovery of gold in the Black Hills, U.S. government policy and the role of the army changed. The presence of gold in the Black Hills left the government powerless, and soon unwilling to turn aside a wave of prospectors that quickly followed. Immigration was skillfully promoted by the Northern Pacific Railroad in the U.S. and Europe to increase passenger revenues, and almost overnight, the Black Hills of the Great Sioux Reservation became a beehive of immigrants, mines and settlements. In May 1875, Lakota delegations headed by Red Cloud and Spotted Tail traveled to Washington, D.C., in an attempt to persuade President Ulysses S. Grant to halt the flow of miners into the Great Sioux Reservation. Grant told the Sioux bluntly that they were being unreasonable in preventing white men from digging for gold. The government could not keep the gold hunters out, but if the Indians persisted in trying to stop them, there was certain to be bloodshed, and once blood was spilled, the government would be forced by the anger of the white people across the nation to remove the Sioux from the Black Hills. The Sioux were still not persuaded, despite U.S. government pressure. Lakota leaders refused to agree to amend the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 or discussed selling the Black Hills. At this time, Americans in the 19th century believed in the manifest destiny of the United States to expand across the continent to the Pacific, and there was increasing political pressure on President Grant to annex the Black Hills from the Sioux. Grant's ultimatum in 1875, Sitting Bull, created the Sundance Alliance between the Lakota and the Cheyenne. On November 9, 1875, Indian Inspector E.C. Watkins complained of the attitude of certain wild and hostile Indians, composed of a small band of 30 or 40 lodges under Sitting Bull, who has been an out-and-out anti-agency Indian, and the bands of other chiefs and headmen under Crazy Horse, and Ogallala Sioux, belonging formerly to the Red Cloud Agency. Numbering about 120 lodges, many agency Indians joined Sitting Bull's camp for a seasonal hunt and a stand against reservation life. Chief Sitting Bull took an active role in encouraging the Unity Camp and sent scouts to reservations to recruit warriors. In November 3, 1875, President Ulysses S. Grant met with Secretary of the Interior Zachariah Chandler, Commissioner of Indian Affairs Edward P. Smith, Secretary of War William W. Belknap, General Philip Sheridan and General George Crook on the issue of the Black Hills. President Grant ordered the U.S. Army to maintain but not enforce the prohibition on miners entering the Black Hills, and ordered the hunting bands to yield the unceded lands and accept reservation life by January 31, 1876, or face military action. Concerned about launching a war against the Lakota without provocation, the government instructed Indian agents in the region to notify the various non-treaty bands to return to the reservation by January 31, 1876. All face potential military action. The U.S. agent at Standing Rock Agency expressed concern that this was insufficient time for the Lakota to respond, as deep winter restricted travel. His request to extend the deadline was denied. General Sheridan considered the notification exercise a waste of time. The matter of notifying the Indians to come in is perhaps well to put on paper, he commented, but it will in all probability be regarded as a good joke by the Indians. Sheridan endorsement, February 4, 1876, National Archives. On his recommendation, approved by the Indian Commissioner and the Secretary of the Interior, it was ordered that these Indians be informed that they must remove to a reservation before January 31, 1876. And that in event of their refusal to come in by the time specified, they would be turned over to the War Department for punishment. The U.S. government knew the Indians could not or would not comply. By the time this order got out to the Indian country, it seemed to mean something else, for many other bands of Sioux were off reservations. It was not practical for them to pick up and move in midwinter. But apparently though the order applied to them, whereupon the trend was toward Sitting Bull, not toward the reservations. The deadline was completely unrealistic even if the band had wanted to acquiesce. It barely allowed enough time to notify the widely scattered groups, let alone permit them to travel through the difficult winter weather to the reservations. On February 8, 1876, after the expiration of the January 31, 1876, ultimatum, the U.S. government declared war on the Sioux. Secretary of the Interior Department turned the matter of the Black Hills over to the War Department to commence punitive warfare, force the submission of hostile Lakota and Cheyenne, pacify the Northern Plains, and take control of the Black Hills in the Great Sioux Reservation.